Recent developments in East Asia have revived hopes that the two Korean states can set aside their differences and reconcile. In the past, such sentiment routinely deteriorated into political schemes, which is why all the previous diplomatic initiatives failed. Yet, regardless of the current sincerity, how would the reunification of the Korean Peninsula work? I'm your host Shirvan and welcome to Caspian Report. Historically, the Korean Peninsula served as a geopolitical land bridge in the area. For Japan, Korea was the gate to mainland Asia. When the peninsula was under Japanese control, Tokyo gained access to the Manchuria region and thereby subdued Chinese and Russian interests. For China, the reverse was true. When Beijing controlled the peninsula, it gained access to the Sea of Japan. From there, the Chinese could restrict the regional maritime trade and thereby shape the behavior of their neighbor to the Far East. Essentially, whoever was in complete control of the peninsula would gain the advantage to forge a proactive policy. Thus, as a geopolitical conduit in East Asia, the Korean Peninsula was repeatedly invaded by foreign powers throughout the course of history. This included the Mongols, Chinese, Japanese, Russians, as well as the Americans. Today, the resurgence of China and the remilitarization of Japan has amplified calls for reunification by South and North Korean policymakers. Both governments recognize that they are too fixated on one another and that their division exposes them to outside forces. Therefore, both the Korean states require reunification to keep foreign powers at bay. In the long run, a united Korean state would reap substantial advantages. The South would gain access to a large labor force. About 14 million northern workers would join the South's 27 million. Although the northern workforce has lower skills, they would also be cheaper to employ. In addition, the North Korean population is younger and has nearly twice as high birth rates. Considering the aging populations in East Asia, the union of Pyongyang and Seoul would give the Koreans substantial demographic advantage in the area. Furthermore, South Korean industrial giants would also gain access to rare minerals and precious metals which are used in electronics. It is estimated that the North's mineral wealth sits at roughly $10 trillion, which is a dozen times larger than that of the South. Finally, the combined military capacity of both states would give a united Korea the ability to shape its own foreign policy in its immediate periphery, and thus bring an end to the peninsula's legacy of foreign subjugation. If this all sounds too good to be true, that's because it is. The risks of a united Korea are just as profound as the benefits. The governments in Pyongyang and Seoul have fundamentally different political, economic, and national beliefs. Moreover, there is a lack of trust, and both factions have weapons pointed at each other. Supporters of the Korean reunification often use the German experience as a template for the peaceful negotiated transition. However, the cultural, ideological, and economic disparities between the two Koreas are far more extreme. For instance, East Germany never embraced totalitarianism to the extent that North Korea has. Plus, the GDP of West Germany was about 3 times that of East Germany, while South Korea is 40 times more prosperous than North Korea. This means that the Korean reunification will be far more taxing for Seoul than it ever was for Berlin. For comparison, since the 1990s, the German government spent about $2 trillion in the eastern cities to improve the economic activity. Given the extreme economic disparity between North and South Korea, the burden for Seoul can be estimated to be at least $3 trillion, meaning Seoul would have to subsidize Pyongyang for decades. In the long run, the gains would be tremendous, but in the short term, it would be an exceedingly heavy burden. Clearly, not everyone is excited about the costs, and in recent years, the South Korean public has steadily lost an interest in reunification. A poll conducted by the Korea Institute for National Unification revealed that 71% of the South Koreans in their 20s outright opposed reunification. So, since there is no template for the Koreans, officials in Seoul and Pyongyang would have to start the reunification process by forming a confederation. This would allow both sides to maintain their existing political and economic systems. It would also forge a sense of trust between the two. At the same time, the confederation would have to create an economic bond that raises the costs of exiting the reunification process, so it would be a point of no return. This would be comparable to the European coal and steel community between France and Germany. To achieve such a union, Seoul and Pyongyang would have to delay decisions on the most sensitive topics. This is a common practice in diplomacy, and it implies that the initial process will largely be symbolic in nature. It also means that a fast-track reunification is impractical because it would disrupt the political and economic balance, so a sincere diplomatic union will take decades. Beyond the initial symbolic arrangement, Pyongyang and Seoul would inevitably encounter a number of economic, political, and security obstructions. Perhaps the most complicated of all is the merger of the two militaries. This also happens to be the most important act if the Korean Confederation is to be anything more than just a paper tiger. In this context, an alliance between the two militaries is not enough. Such an arrangement would be easily exploited by foreign powers. As such, the fusion of the two militaries is necessary, but the devil is in the details. Essentially, Seoul and Pyongyang would have to reduce the security risks they pose to each other. This implies the demilitarization of the border and the exit of American forces from the peninsula. The problem, however, is that there is no way to accomplish this without exposing one side to the other. For instance, if the North removed its artillery from Seoul's range and dismantled its nuclear stockpile, it would essentially give up its primary deterrence. That is just not going to happen, as it would render the reunification process as insincere. The only way to conceive mutual incentives for demilitarization is to create a joint force with a shared command of the Korean militaries. However, this would bring its own complications since there are just too many ways to deceive the other. In addition, a joint military force would likely introduce fierce bureaucratic rivalries that would raise the risks of a military coup. Yet, if somehow the Korean militaries manage to form a dynamically shared command, then there are still additional political complications. More than anything, the government of Kim is preoccupied with survival. This is why they want nuclear capabilities and remain closed off to the world. Entering a political union with Seoul would most certainly undercut Pyongyang's influence. More precisely, opening the North Korean economy to the outside world would spark a political impasse as the elites would compete for wealth and power. In fact, even the slightest symbolic opening, think of relaxed travel restrictions and joint economic ventures, would contribute to such a crisis. For instance, in East Germany, the leadership had initially intended to attentively manage the reunification process. However, once the Berlin Wall came down, the situation quickly spiraled out of control. Germans in the east relocated to the west, and the government in East Berlin collapsed soon afterwards. The same fate awaits the government in Pyongyang, so regardless of how carefully the Korean Confederation is planned, not everything will go according to plan. For this reason, the government in Pyongyang is discouraged by its low survival prospects in the reunification process. Besides economic, military, and political obstructions, there are geopolitical implications that must be considered. The neighboring powers are unlikely to idly stand by and welcome a unified Korea with open arms. China, for instance, is concerned that the reunification of the Korean Peninsula would allow the Americans to move closer towards the Chinese heartland. Clearly, this would be unacceptable for Beijing. As such, the Chinese leadership prefers the current stalemate in the peninsula. If reunification started without the blessing of China, and if the government in Beijing was suspicious of Washington, then the Chinese would likely do whatever they can to disrupt the process. To gain China's benefit of the doubt, the Korean Confederation would have to reduce its relationship with the United States. This means that American troops would have to leave South Korea. Meanwhile, for Japan, the Korean Peninsula serves as a land bridge into the Japanese home islands. The only reason why the South Koreans and Japanese are not hostile towards one another is because they are both members of the American security umbrella in East Asia. As a result, the overlapping geopolitical objectives of Seoul and Tokyo have been put on hold. This is the status quo that the Japanese prefer, and if the Korean states reunited, Japan would need the Korean Confederation to be part of the US alliance network. Obviously, this sits at odds with Chinese interests. The third actor is the United States. America's primary interest in the Korean Peninsula is the proliferation of nuclear weapons, so Washington would only support the reunification process if it could settle on a denuclearization agreement. Beyond nuclear weapons, the United States would seek to maintain the regional balance of power and restrain China's options in the periphery. In this reference, Washington's interests are in line with Tokyo's. The final regional power is Moscow. The Russians have greater and more immediate concerns elsewhere and prefer not to upset their Chinese counterparts. At the same time, however, the Russians are seeking to gain leverage on the Americans to extract concessions in other regions such as the European plain. So the attitude of Moscow regarding the Korean reunification is opportunistic and depends largely on its relationship with Beijing and Washington. At large, a united Korea would be more capable to shape the affairs of the peninsula. However, the Korean states would have to overcome exceedingly difficult economic, political, and military complications. Even if somehow those internal challenges were overcome, Korean reunification would be met with disapproval by the regional powers. Having said that, foreign subjugation is exactly why North and South Korea require unity in the first place. I have been your host Shirvan from Caspian Report. Credit goes to our contributors on Patreon who give us the means to produce content like this. If you enjoy Caspian Report and you want to support our channel to remain independent and self-sustained, please consider joining our community on patreon.com/Caspian Report. For now, thank you for your time and Sarol.